Before this courtroom laughed, one innocent man was moments away from losing everything. A little girl stood up, her voice shaking, and said words no one believed. They mocked her. They ignored her. But seconds later, the impossible began to happen. What followed silenced the judge, stunned the lawyers, and changed a verdict forever. This is not just a story about justice, it is about faith, courage, and a moment that rewrote destiny. If stories that shake your heart and remind you that miracles still happen speak to you, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs hope, and comment below what you believe about the impossible. Let's start this video. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tired air, a place where hope usually came to be judged and quietly buried. The father stood in chains near the defense table, his eyes lowered not in shame but in exhaustion. Weeks in a cell had drained the color from his face, yet something steady remained in his posture, a dignity no accusation could fully erase. He had replayed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, each version ending the same way, with a sentence pronounced and his life reduced to a number of years. Still, somewhere deep inside, he believed truth mattered, even if no one else seemed to care. Across the room, his daughter sat alone on the hard wooden bench, her feet barely touching the floor. She watched every movement, every glance, trying to understand a world that suddenly felt cruel and confusing. This was the man who carried her on his shoulders, who worked late so she could study, who taught her that honesty was the strongest shield. Now strangers spoke about him as if he were a monster. Her chest tightened with every word from the prosecutor, whose confident tone painted a picture so convincing it felt unreal, like a story borrowed from someone else's life. The prosecutor walked slowly before the jury, presenting evidence with practiced ease. Documents were raised, names were spoken, timelines carefully arranged. Each sentence landed like a hammer, striking harder than the last. The defense lawyer tried to interrupt, pointing out small inconsistencies, missing details that did not align. But his voice felt thin in that room, drowned by certainty. The judge listened silently, occasionally nodding, his expression neutral, almost bored. For him, this was another file, another case to be resolved before the day ended. Whispers spread among the audience, quiet judgments exchanged without shame. Some believed the father looked guilty simply because he stood there accused. Others pitied him but accepted his fate as inevitable. The daughter heard none of it clearly, only a dull roar in her ears. Her hands trembled as she clenched them together, nails pressing into her palms. She wanted to run to her father, to hug him, to promise everything would be fine. But the distance between them felt enormous, as if a wall invisible yet unbreakable had been placed there. The judge finally spoke, his voice calm and authoritative, announcing that the court was ready to proceed toward a verdict. Those words hit the girl harder than any accusation. Her breathing became shallow, and her vision blurred. In that instant, fear gave way to something else, something she could not name but could feel burning inside her chest. It was the same feeling she had when she prayed at night, whispering hopes she did not fully understand but trusted anyway. Without thinking, she stood up, the bench scraping loudly against the floor. Every head turned. The sound echoed unnaturally loud, slicing through the formal silence of the courtroom. A court officer shifted, prepared to intervene, while the judge frowned, clearly annoyed by the disruption. The girl's legs shook, yet she did not. Sit back down. Her voice, when it came, was small but steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. She spoke words that made no sense to those who heard them, words that sounded like the imagination of a desperate child rather than a serious plea for justice. For a brief moment, silence followed, as if the room itself needed time to process what had been said. Then laughter broke out, scattered at first, then growing louder. Some smiled in disbelief, others shook their heads. Even the judge's lips curved slightly, not in cruelty but in mild amusement. He leaned forward, asking her to explain herself, his tone indulgent. How could a child promise something so impossible? How could faith compete with law, procedure, and evidence stacked neatly on paper? The girl swallowed, her throat dry, and looked directly at the judge. She did not see a powerful man then, only someone who had the ability to listen or to ignore. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained firm as she spoke again, explaining that she believed in justice greater than what was written in files. The courtroom laughed once more, louder this time, convinced they were witnessing nothing more than an emotional outburst. No one realized that the line between routine judgment and the impossible had already begun to fade. The judge lifted his hand slightly, signaling for order, and nodded toward the court officer to have the girl sit down. As the officer took a step forward, something strange rippled through the room, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. The judge shifted in his chair, his brow tightening as if a sudden wave of dizziness had passed through him. He straightened his back and placed his palms firmly on the desk, preparing to stand and reassert control. The movement never completed. His legs refused him, locked in place as though the floor had claimed him. A murmur spread through the courtroom, soft but rapidly growing. The judge attempted again, pushing harder this time, his jaw clenched. Panic flickered across his face, quickly masked by professional composure, but not quickly enough to escape notice. The prosecutor rose instinctively, confused, while the defense lawyer stared in disbelief. The father watched silently, chains clinking faintly as he shifted, unsure whether to fear what was happening or hope it meant something more. The judge cleared his throat and called for assistance, his voice strained now, stripped of its earlier authority. Court staff rushed forward, followed by medical personnel summoned in haste. Blood pressure was checked, reflexes tested, whispered conversations exchanged in urgent tones. Nothing appeared wrong, yet the judge remained seated, fully conscious and fully unable to stand. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier had vanished, replaced by an uneasy silence heavy with questions no one could answer. In the midst of the confusion, the girl stood still, her eyes fixed on the judge. She felt no triumph, only a deep sense of seriousness. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, and quietly, almost inaudibly, she prayed. Not for punishment, not for spectacle, but for truth. The father noticed her lips moving and felt a sudden tightening in his chest, a mixture of fear and an unfamiliar spark of hope he had tried to bury weeks ago. After what felt like an eternity, the judge raised his hand again. The room fell silent instantly. He asked that the girl be brought closer. The officer hesitated, then complied. She walked forward slowly, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Standing before the bench, she seemed impossibly small, yet the entire courtroom felt focused on her presence. The judge looked at her, his expression no longer amused, but deeply unsettled. He asked her to repeat what she had said earlier. Her voice shook slightly this time, but she did not look away. She repeated the same words, calmly, without embellishment. The judge closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if weighing something far heavier than the case file in front of him. When he opened them again, there was doubt there, and humility. He ordered an immediate recess and demanded a full review of the evidence, his voice firm despite his condition. Behind closed doors, certainty began to unravel. Witness statements contradicted each other when examined closely. A timeline failed to align with newly reviewed footage. Documents once taken at face value revealed signs of manipulation. What had seemed like a solid case began to collapse under the weight of its own inconsistencies. The judge listened in silence, each revelation striking deeper than the last. He realized how easily routine had replaced justice, how quickly assumptions had hardened into verdicts. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The judge, still seated, spoke with a voice that carried both authority and regret. He announced that the evidence was insufficient, that critical errors had been made, and that the accused man was innocent. The words echoed through the room, followed by gasps and stunned silence. The father's knees gave way, and he sank to the floor, overwhelmed, tears streaming freely as the chains were removed from his wrists. The girl ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He held her tightly, as if afraid she might disappear, his shoulders shaking as months of fear finally released their grip. The courtroom watched in silence, many with tears in their eyes, witnessing a moment that felt far larger than a legal decision. It felt like a correction, not just of a case, but of something broken much deeper. Slowly, the judge placed his hands on the desk once more. The room held its breath as he pushed himself upward. This time, his legs responded. He stood, steady and upright, as though nothing had ever been wrong. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The judge took a careful step, then another, his face pale but resolute. He looked toward the father and daughter, his eyes shining with emotion he did not attempt to hide. Today, he said quietly, justice reminded us of its true purpose. Not to condemn quickly, but to listen carefully. Not to trust appearances, but to seek truth. The room remained silent, every word sinking deep. The father and daughter turned toward the exit, walking out together into the light beyond the courtroom doors, free at last, leaving behind a space forever changed by a moment when faith spoke, was mocked, and then proved impossible to ignore.